In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. This is how the book of Genesis of the Hebrew Bible begins. God creates waters and land and says that it is good. God creates sun and moon and says that it's good. God creates the plants and the animals and says that it's good. God creates human beings and says that it's good. For everything that God creates, God pauses to contemplate, to look, and says, "It is good." Even the tree of knowledge, from which Adam and Eve eat, and the serpent who is blamed with tricking them, are within the category of "it is good." In this creation story, there's only one thing that God says is not good. It's not good for a human to be alone. So God creates another human and instructs them to make more humans. And when creating all of that exists, the one thing that God says is not good is for humans to be alone. It turns out that scientists agree. They estimate that longevity is only about 20% genetic, leaving the other 80% for environmental factors, including one's social environment. In the Blue Zones research that investigated cultures with the most centenarians, a number of social factors emerged as correlated with longer life. Committing to a partner, having a group of close friends, living near family, investing in children, being around people who were a good influence toward healthy habits, attending weekly services of a faith tradition. Nice job, everybody. These were all factors associated with longer life in the study. Last week, Reverend Roberta contrasted loneliness and solitude, and I want to reinforce that distinction because it's an important one. When we're surrounded by people all of the time, it can be stressful, and it can keep us from the reflection that can lead to true wisdom. Those of us who enjoy being with our own thoughts, myself very much included, may be doing ourselves a disservice by indulging too much in alone time, though. Personally, if I'm alone too much, I get depressed. But if I'm with people too much, I get irritable. I commonly find that I'm happier after a social event, even if I didn't want to go in the first place. On the other hand, I can get cranky if I stay too long. Certainly a balance is the aim. But I wonder how well calibrated we are for optimal balance these days. In his book, Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters at the End, physician Atul Gawande discusses patterns of multi-generational living. When families or societies have fewer financial resources, the generations tend to live together. Elders help care for the young, and the young help care for the elders. Similarly, those with fewer financial resources, on average, remarry faster after a divorce. When people have greater financial means, again on average, they tend to choose not to live together or to hold out longer before remarrying. When they have the means, some people even choose to remarry but maintain separate residences. In this exploration today, I don't mean to suggest a one-size-fits-all model, but I do hope that you'll be left with a question or two to contemplate. Whether it's a matter of not wanting to be a burden or wanting freedom, living separately certainly is an effective way to avoid conflict. But is it worth it? It seems to me that there's a high price to pay for avoiding conflict. In fact, it seems the polarization that we're seeing in our country is due in part to avoiding conflict and focusing on freedom. I know that may sound counterintuitive, but I think it's part of how we've gotten here. In Robert Putnam's classic Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, he writes about the decline in social capital, civic engagement, and community cohesion. The tension of conflict can be creative and a life-giving force, but typically only if we have some degree of respect for those with whom we have the tension. And the social capital that we build in our day-to-day lives is not the same as it once was. Mark Dunkelman cites city living, more shopping options, including online shopping, making it so that we aren't interacting with our neighbors as much as we used to. Driving instead of walking, longer commutes that take us further away from the communities in which we live, and even air conditioning that encourages us to be inside rather than to enjoy the cooler evening air on a porch. All of these are aspects of our culture that have us in less contact with our neighbors and thus not building relationships in the same organic ways of the past. Plus, doing community is hard. It's hard, and the payoffs are not immediate. It's like eating vegetables or flossing our teeth or attending to our posture. If I sit slumped in my chair today and don't floss, I probably won't notice tomorrow. I'll notice a few years down the line when my gums are receding and the roots of my teeth are exposed. I'll notice my inattention to my posture when I look in the mirror and see how curved my back has become, and when I feel how my neck and shoulders are sore from holding up my head at a slanted angle. Humans are not naturally good at doing the thing that takes effort, the difficult thing in the present, if the gain or avoiding the loss happens decades in the future. Sure, we evolved for some saving, for some attentiveness to the future, maybe a year or 2 or 3, but not a decade, and certainly not 50 years. Some Native Americans developed the idea of thinking in terms of 7 generations forward for decision making. So what would serve 7 generations out? But note that that had to be developed as a cognitive strategy, not instinctual. As a highly adaptable species, some of us can do 401ks and exercise in a gym, but it's just not what we were built for. Similarly, we weren't built for the social situation that we now find ourselves in, where we circulate in metal machines among over 3 million people in our metro area and can fly off to engage with any one of billions of people. We have access to these people, and yet many cultural observers are writing books like Bowling Alone, The Vanishing Neighbor, and Shades of Loneliness, Pathologies of a Technological Society. Perhaps the drive for solitude and avoiding conflict is parallel to our drive to eat sweet, fatty, and salty foods. These drives have served us really well. They're just somewhat poorly aligned with our current situation. And I know many of us have had far too much solitude in recent history, in the last few months, last year or two. Some of us more. Many of us are more aware now of the difference it makes to be together with others. I just see the day coming when we've had our fill again and are ready to retreat, ready to reactively avoid conflict, ready to defend our freedom rather than stay in relationship. This freedom piece is important. I see even those who love to be needed, wanting to avoid expectations being placed on them. We want our acts of service to be gifts, not something that another expected or demanded. In relationships, we do have expectations though. Oftentimes, we humans have expectations from past experiences or fantasies about the way things should be, and we might not even be aware of them. Here's an example. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Downton Abbey, a television series set in England in the 1920s. For those less familiar, the storylines center on a household of a lord, including both the family and the servants of the household. Carson is the butler, and Mrs. Hughes is the head housekeeper. Mrs. Hughes isn't married, but thinks that the title is more fitting than Miss, given her position. Carson and Mrs. Hughes worked together side by side for decades, and late in life, Carson finally proposes to Mrs. Hughes. Before they marry, they have a number of conversations about expectations. Nevertheless, they both find themselves dissatisfied when their expectations are not being met. Whereas they had always eaten dinner with the other staff after the Lord's family was served, Carson now wants to eat dinner at home and for his wife to prepare that meal. After a long day of work, side by side with her husband, Mrs. Hughes isn't particularly keen on preparing a full meal. And also she's relied on professional cooks for these many years. And so she doesn't have the cooking skills to meet his expectations. Of course, they eventually sort it out. How many of us can relate to this, though? I know I certainly can. We bring our past into our present relationships. This is true in our expectations of dating and marriage, parent-child relationships, our relationships with siblings, and friendships. For me, some relationship conflict has been related to moving away. I imagine many of you can relate to this since so many people have moved here or there over time. My expectations of friendship when we live nearby is different than my expectations when hundreds of miles separate us. I've had friends who disappointed me when I expected them to be attentive to my needs, and I've disappointed my friends when not being attentive enough to theirs. Negotiating expectations seems to be the crux of the matter. Following through and holding one another accountable are vital too. We can't do that well, though, without having agreed upon the expectations in the first place, though. Every time the UUC board meets, your leaders recite UUC's mission: to celebrate dignity and respect for all, nurture lifelong spiritual growth, act for justice and equality, and serve the wider community. As a staff member here, to serve the congregation and focus on your mission, the statements of values and commitments delight me. They delight me so much that I'm going to read it again. To celebrate dignity and respect for all, to nurture lifelong spiritual growth, act for justice and equality, and serve the wider community. That's what we're here to do. The UUC board also has a covenant that reads, "We covenant to be direct and straightforward, address an issue with the person involved, communicate respectfully, listen with an open mind, support board decisions without rancor, and see and support the best in each other." I really appreciate the care in creating clear expectations among themselves. Do you feel like, as members, the expectations are as clear as they are for the board members? As Margie read earlier, Chalice UU congregation in Escondido, California, the expectations of membership are very specific and clear. They're outlined on the website for everyone's reference. How did you feel when Margie was reading through the expectations? Did you find it reassuring? Or was it uncomfortable? Or did you have a different response? Community is important for individual health, and it doesn't stop there. 170 years ago, Unitarian minister Theodore Parker wrote, that democracy is a government by all the people, for all the people. Political scientist Robert Putnam will tell you that healthy democracies depend on social connectedness. And if you start with Genesis and keep reading through the Pentateuch, a great deal of the rest is about what humans do and how the descendants of Abraham and Sarah try to form a functioning society with rules, judges, a priestly class overseeing religion, and so on. As a species, we've been at this social project for thousands of years. And in some ways, we've gotten really good at it insofar as societies function as well as they do. Obviously, we all know that it's a huge work in progress, though. Reverend Sharon Wiley says, participating in religious community is an act of resistance in a culture that pushes us into disconnection and isolation. Our Unitarian Universalist vision is healing and transformative, a world where love and justice are the central guiding forces. This week, I hope you'll take some time to consider your expectations of your friends, family, the UUC community, and yourself. Maybe there will be an opportunity for you to clarify your expectations or the expectations others have of you. And in the weeks and months that are before us, I hope you'll pay attention to expectations. And when conflict arises, I hope you'll stick with it and find the creativity, growth, and health that can be manifest in community.